Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending NYSTRA's 25th Annual Multi-Day Conference. My name is Jessica Andrianos, and I am the moderator for today's session. If you have any questions about conference-related issues, please message me directly in the chat, and I will reply to you. If you have any questions for the presenter, you can either raise your hand, or you can also type something in the message bar as well. Before we begin, please make sure to mute your mic if it is not already muted when you are not asking a question or participating in the discussion. Please also make sure to silence your cell phones or, like I said, have yourself on mute so that we are not hearing everything going on in the background where you are. If you're seeking CEUs for this session, you will receive 0.15 CEUs at the end of the session. There will be 2 requirements to receiving credit for attending any live sessions. At the end of the session, you will be asked to comment your full name in the chat section, and you will also be asked to complete the attestation form at the conclusion of the session. This was sent out to everybody, I believe yesterday, and was also posted on the Facebook page. Once you have completed that attestation form, it could be sent to nystra2021@gmail.com. You do not have to do that right away. Just have to make sure that you get that in before June 13th, okay? One update for everybody is we added an extra live session today at 5 o'clock, which is how to broach sensitive and difficult topics with clients with Sherry and Megan. That update to the schedule was posted on our Facebook page. If you need any information with conference, any updates will be posted on our Facebook page, okay? So today's session is titled Understanding Recovery Experience, Constraints and Facilitators of Recreation and Early Substance Use Disorder Recovery. So we have today is Jason Page. He is an assistant professor of recreation at SUNY Cortland. He is currently finishing up his doctoral work at Clemson University and plans on continuing his research on leisure, substance abuse, and mental health disorders following graduation. So welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Sorry to keep you inside on the first nice afternoon we've had in upstate New York for, I don't know, ever. Yeah, so let's get started. I'm sorry, I just zoned right out there for a moment. All right, so we're going to talk about recovery today and understanding the recovery experience. And this was originally submitted for presentation last year for the conference. And man, when I submitted this, I had no idea of what was going to happen, as none of us did, obviously, but things changed quite significantly. This was phase 1 of my dissertation, which I'm now lovingly terming the duct tape dissertation, because I've had to patch it, remake it, remodel it, refashion it, and roll with COVID waves and all kinds of fun stuff. I've, at this point, rewritten my dissertation 3 times because of COVID. So this is part 1. And when we originally looked at this project, it was part of planning for an intervention study that by the end of March last year, I suddenly realized there's no way we're going to be doing interventions. And after a long conversation with my advisor, who was kind of adamant that by the summer we'd be good, I decided just to go ahead and rewrite things. So this is kind of where we're at. So by the end of this session, you should be able to identify 3 key elements of Crawford and Godby's leisure constraints theory, describe how these elements interact to create constraints and facilitators to leisure experiences, understand how certain lifestyle elements, for example, perceived support, can influence leisure participation, and then finally identify at least 2 strategies to enhance leisure access for individuals in early recovery from substance use disorders. So here's our outline. I'm going to start with some basic introductions, do a quick study overview, jump into some operational definitions so you can kind of get a sense of where we were coming from for the study. Going to review leisure constraints theory, look at our methods and findings of the research. Then I do want to do some discussion with you about how these findings impact us and the way we provide services to people in early recovery. Then beyond that, think of the implications of this study and look at some future work. And then there'll be time at the end there for a wrap up and some conclusion and some questions. Are we all good? Okay to carry on? Thumbs up is fantastic. All righty. All right, so study overview. So the purpose of this study was really to look at contextual factors that people experience during early recovery from substance use disorders, and then try to get a sense of how they affect leisure participation and how they serve to constrain leisure participation. And so the initial sort of focus of this study was on constraints and facilitators. But as we went through this process, really the participants that we worked with were really talking a lot about constraints, and they weren't so focused on facilitators. And so at this point, we're really going to be talking a lot about constraints. And probably at some point in the future, we're going to kind of flip the script a little bit and start considering how we can facilitate greater experience and exposure to leisure. So with all that in mind, the study objectives, like I said, we were looking at those contextual factors and really trying to think about how they affected residents and how they accessed leisure. So there were two kind of objectives within that. The first was to examine the role of leisure in early recovery and really get the recovery's perspective. So this was a qualitative study using paired and triad interviews, as we'll get to, but really asking the residents themselves, the participants themselves, like, what does leisure look like for you? How do you engage in leisure? How do you access these things? What are your thoughts on leisure within the programs? And this is something that, you know, we haven't really seen empirically done. So even just that phase was very exploratory. And then the next objective was to examine constraints on leisure participation while living in community residences. So, you know, within that context of leisure in these people's lives, what are the things that hold them back from leisure participation? What would they like to do to enhance their leisure experience? And how can leisure influence their recovery? So a few definitions before we get into some of the more methodological things. We're going to look at the definition of the following things. So community residence, recovery, leisure, leisure constraints, and paired or triad interviews. Also just coffee because. All right, so community residence. How many of you work in the substance use disorder field? So a few of you. So for those of you who don't, or who, even if you do and you're just not familiar with this sort of level of care, community residence is a housing program that provides sober, supportive environment. It is staffed 24/7. And the idea is that while residents are there, they're receiving treatment at usually an outpatient provider, but the staff at the community residents themselves are really more focused on things like case management and assisting the individual finding additional supports beyond their time at the community residence. It's worth noting that in New York, this level of care is gradually being phased out and rewritten with new regulations. So this was kind of like the last opportunity to really look at these programs as they currently exist. And even as we were collecting subsequent data from for the subsequent phases of this study, already we were seeing transitions in these programs. So this level of care is kind of disappearing. That being said, even on a regulatory level, this level of care is disappearing. There will be an alternative and we'll still be experiencing many of these same problems. It will just come under a different heading, under a different set of regulations, right? So there's still relevance to the information that's being collected. Recovery. This is SAMHSA's working definition. They've been working on it since 2012. This is probably the more kind of ubiquitous definition. Essentially, recovery is viewed as a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. A couple of things worth noting in this definition. Abstinence is not part of it. Okay, there is no requirement for abstinence. to be engaged in a recovery lifestyle. What is important here is that the individual is making choices to improve their quality of life. All right. From a methodological perspective, recovery is a really poorly defined concept, ironically, in a similar way to leisure, because it means very different things to different people. And the more person-centered we are, the more difficult the concept becomes to define in a meaningful empirical way. So throughout this study, we used the working definition because, quite frankly, from a treatment perspective, it's the one that's most consistently used. And it allowed for the broadest understanding of recovery as a concept without getting into very narrow terms of, is this person using substances? Where are they at? How long do they have? And all of those very specific questions that starts to eliminate participants and starts to alienate various folks in the recovery community. So we very much stuck with this definition. So I just said leisure and recovery have that connection of being somewhat subjective and making definition of those concepts a little bit more challenging. This was the working definition we used for this study, our operational definition. So leisure is time free from obligations, work, and tasks of daily living. It can be viewed as activities done during free time that are freely chosen, provide opportunities for personal growth, and help the individual feel good about themselves. And this was the definition that we used at the beginning of our interviews to kind of provide an understanding of what we were talking about when we were talking about leisure. Because there's, we all think we know what leisure is, but from the perspective of getting consistent information from participants, we needed to start with a clear understanding of that. So this was the definition we used as our jumping off point during interviews. Next definition was leisure constraints. Okay, so these were factors that are assumed by researchers and perceived or experienced by individuals to limit the formation of leisure preferences and to inhibit or prohibit participation and enjoyment in leisure. And the fact is, we're all constrained in some way when it comes to leisure participation. I would personally like to be enjoying my leisure participation on a beach in Barbados, preferably with a medicinal beverage by my side. However, I have a job and bills to pay and responsibilities, apparently, that I need to fulfill. So I can't do that today. Those are constraints. And we all face them at various levels, okay? We're gonna talk more about constraint theory in a little bit, but this was our jumping off point for this understanding of, what is a constraint? And then this is the last definition. And so originally the plan was to use focus groups. Initial recruitment went really well. Lots of people signed up and no one showed up. So we had to switch our methodology a little bit and roll with what we could. So we switched to this kind of pair or triad interview approach, which essentially allowed us to work with smaller groups. I would say that we definitely made lemonade on this one. Working with the paired or triad interviews really allowed us to talk much more to the people who showed up. Focus group, 7 or 8 people, everyone gets a little bit of time, but not too much. With the smaller interview groups, we were actually able to get quite a lot of content discussed, okay? And a lot more ideas kind of came out through more natural discussion rather than a focus group, which tends to be much more scripted. So all things considered, I think this worked better, and I would probably keep this approach, even though there's more interviews to transcribe. Ultimately, it worked much better with the group we were working with. So what could have been a disaster really turned out to be to our benefit, even though in the moment when I was freaking out because no one had shown up, it didn't feel much like a blessing. So onwards. Any questions about any of those definitions? Nope. All right, keep rolling. So leisure constraints theory. How many of you are familiar with leisure constraints theory? Remembering way back? Nope. Somewhat, a little bit. All right, so this will be a good review, good refresher. So leisure constraints theory essentially, Crawford and Godby in 1987 were writing leisure constraints to challenge this notion of choice in leisure. Because there's this idea that leisure is a chosen thing, but there's a restriction on that, right? It's not a freely chosen thing necessarily. You know, for, like I said, if I had my complete free choice, I would do X, Y, or Z, as would be the case for many of you, right? I would love to spend much more time touring the vineyards of southern France, for example. Clearly, you can see why I picked this field, right? But I can't do that. There are constraints. What my leisure choice is always going to be restricted in some way. And this is what Crawford and Godby were getting to in leisure constraints. And they kind of really came to this point where choice is a relative concept. And depending on your situation, socially, educationally, in terms of gender, in terms of social power, and all these other aspects, you have a relatively different amount of choice. Okay, women generally have less leisure freedom than men do in our society. Therefore, their choice is very different from that of a male. And so this is really where Crawford and Godby were headed. And they really wanted to accept that there are this range of personal and social constraints on leisure. So women often experience more burden around domestic chores. Interestingly, over the last year, while more people were working from home, men, I feel like I'm going to put a target on my back as well as some other folks, men did less around the house than women, and they actually reversed the trend of increasing male time spent doing household chores. Child raising and rearing were affected as well. Women disproportionately experienced constraints on their work life, their home life, and their leisure life during the last year, because even though many of them were working from home, all it did was reinforce traditional blurred lines that they'd experienced when they were working out of the home. So, you know, these are just very real constraints. And in terms of Crawford and Godby's initial model, they focused on 3 key elements. So intrapersonal, interpersonal, and structural constraints. And I'm going to get into those in just a minute. So intrapersonal constraints, these are about the decisions that we make based on our own ideas, thoughts, and conceptions. All right. So I would love to take up ballet. I know you would not have expected ballet coming from me. However, I'm not sure I'd look good in tights or have any balance or coordination or sense of rhythm. You know, these are all kind of impediments to ballet. I can count to 4, and I was told if you can count to 4, you can dance. However, I would challenge even that basic assumption. So if we think about interpersonal constraints, there are all these little doubts that we have individually that hold us back from trying something, even if we're like, you know, it'd be really cool if I could do ballet. But then that little voice in the back of our head says, but you'd look lousy in tights. Or you have 4 or 5 left feet. I went past 2 left feet many years ago. All right. And this happens to all of us, right? We want to try things, but we have doubts. And so those doubts start to influence the choices we make. And so it goes from, I don't want to try this activity, to more general conceptions of, I just can't dance. Right. And so we pile on these kind of interpersonal doubts and constraints. And so we start to build these barriers and constraints in our own minds. So this is the first kind of level of constraint. The next one, or the next level, is interpersonal constraints. And these arise because we don't talk to people about our intrapersonal things. So our personal doubts, we don't communicate them. And so we experience more barriers. All right, so my friend invites me to take up a tap class, so tap dance, because, you know, why not, right? I've always been a noisy stepper, so I'm already halfway there. okay? But because I don't tell this person about my issues with, 5 left feet and my own personal doubts, I start to make excuses. Like, oh yeah, I'd love to do that with you, but Wednesday nights, I just have a standing arrangement on a Wednesday night. And then I'll make something up, all right? So we start to experience relational challenges and constraints. We start to throw these barriers up too, based on our personal doubts. And so what we start to see is this kind of our interpersonal, intrapersonal life, our own internal monologue starts to affect our external relationships, okay? And we start to experience more barriers because eventually Jason becomes the person who will never follow through. He's always busy when I ask him to do something, all right? Or he'll say he'll be there and then he just doesn't show up, okay? Do you have friends like that? Maybe you're that friend in this new post-COVID reality. Look at me being optimistic with the post-COVID. Hey, I'm always an optimist. All right. So, and so if you do have friends like that, you kind of know, like you stop asking them to do things with you because you just figure they're not going to show up anyway. All right. And maybe that's the hope. I don't know. If I just don't do it enough, they just won't ask me anymore. It's like if you do the dishes badly enough for long enough, eventually someone else will do them. That's the theory. I have 2 children. That doesn't work in my house, unfortunately. All right. And the last level are structural constraints. And these are like those external things that we just don't control. Okay. So growing up, I never had the opportunity to learn to ski. There's a couple of good reasons for this. In England, didn't get much snow. So that would have meant I had to travel. Okay, which I didn't grow up in a family where taking a ski trip was really something that was doable. Okay, I also grew up in a very flat part of the world. Okay, which kind of inhibits your ability to go down hills, the lack of hills, that is. I once told somebody about the dry ski slope we had in my town growing up, and they looked at me, being from central New York, like, what the heck is a dry ski slope? Susan, I can see your face. You are confused also by this concept. So a dry ski slope, for those of you who have never had the joy of a dry ski slope, is essentially a hill with a roped net kind of put into the ground. It's like a mat, and you can kind of ski on it. The wonderful thing is, if you fall on a dry ski slope, you basically get shredded like cheese on a grater. It's amazing stuff. Yeah, it's great fun, said no one ever. But yeah, so skiing wasn't something that I really had an opportunity to do when I was younger, right? So those were all structural constraints. There's a reason why people from warm countries don't tend to participate in the Winter Olympics, right? Because there's just not that access or opportunity. On the other hand, Norway, Finland, Sweden, they have access to all these cold weather activities and they do really well at the Winter Olympics, okay? So when we're talking about structural constraints, those are some of them. There's also financial resources. So how much money do you have? How many of you have horses? No, lots of shaking. Marty's a hard shake of the head. There are no horses, Marty? No, okay. How many of you own a super yacht to go, trolling around the Caribbean? No, you don't have a helicopter for those short trips? No, none of you are Bezos level wealthy then? Okay. Would any of you like to be? That's a mixed bag of responses. Okay. So obviously, if you have a lot of money, you may think, well, I can do whatever I want. But even at that level, there are constraints. And this is one of the kind of interesting things about leisure constraints. It doesn't matter who you are or what means you have, you will always be constrained in some way. All right. My daughter is obsessed with the British royal family and she thinks it would be a fabulous lifestyle. Except she doesn't realize yet that essentially you're a prisoner to your own title and your job and your lifestyle, right? There's not really much choice there. So it doesn't matter who you are, there are always some kinds of constraints. generally speaking, just because there are constraints, it doesn't mean you're not going to participate, right? It just means that it may be more challenging. And there are some things that you're going to be like, well, there's just no way and I can't participate. There are other things you may try to figure out. If you're really interested in doing something, you'll find a way, right? Think about the Jamaican bobsled team, for example, right? If you're interested, if you're really driven, you'll find a way. And so this is a process of constraint negotiation. And really what we're talking about here is that, well, I'm really busy, but I can get a sitter. You know, I don't have access to public transport, so I'll have to figure out a way to ride share or whatever it is. And this is that constraint negotiation. It's finding a way around some of the barriers that we face, right? So we are able to overcome some constraints. So just because we have constraints, it doesn't mean that our story is written, okay? The thing is, even if we are able to overcome constraints, the nature of our participation is still impacted by the constraint, okay? So for example, if you need to do a ride share to get to an activity, you're still kind of constrained by when you get picked up, when the person who's driving is ready to leave, okay? You have to be somewhat nice to the person who's doing the carpool or else you're stuck without a ride, okay? All of these little things. So while yes, we can overcome constraints, there are still issues around how we engage in those activities once we're there. Even with things like childcare, if you have a sitter, okay, maybe you're doing a yoga class, and after yoga, a few of the folks in the class want to go get a coffee together or have a drink, right? But if you have a sitter, you have to get home, so you can't fully engage in the social sphere of that activity. All right, even though you can do the primary activity that you went out to do, you can't do the add-ons. So later on, Crawford, Jackson, and Godby would actually re-examine their model, and they would start to put this into a hierarchical idea wherein each of these levels of constraint were kind of taken in turn. So you first of all had to address your personal factors, those intrapersonal constraints, and identify leisure preferences. From there, you would have to address interpersonal constraints and personal relationships, things like that. And then once you'd negotiate those constraints, you'd have to get into those structural constraints, and figure out how to negotiate those. So this was later work, and although it has its use and value, because we didn't know any, or because we had very limited understanding of the constraints that the folks in early recovery were facing, this really wasn't what we were looking at. We were just looking at each of these constraints as they came up in conversation, right? So we weren't so worried about how they necessarily negotiated constraints. We just wanted to get an idea about, well, what are the constraints that you have? And start to understand how we could maybe develop programs to help, what kind of understanding the folks we worked with had of leisure generally, and then move them forward from that point. But this was later work that was taken, and it is more known, the hierarchical model, than the initial. But like I said, because we were doing a lot of exploratory work, we didn't really spend too much time with that. All right, any questions on the constraint stuff? All right, well, good. All right, so the methods for this study, so our target population were individuals living in the community residences. And so a couple of reasons we picked this group. I always say we, it's me, I did this, it's a royal we. I'd like to say that because I think I'm classy, I'm not, but we'll still say we. The reason that we looked at this group were because it's really an understudied group. A lot of people look at folks when they're in residential inpatient settings or when they have outpatient treatment and they're kind of 6 months into their recovery. But there's this missing kind of group where we don't really look at people who are in that very early stage of recovery. They're not in an inpatient anymore. They don't really have an established recovery pattern. And there are a couple of reasons for this that we'll get into, but that was partly why this group was selected. In terms of leisure, This group were picked because they have limited personal funds. So they're already facing certain constraints, okay? There are requirements that they have to attend treatment during the day, right? So that's also an impact on their time. There are limits as well about things that they can and can't do in terms of work and vocation and volunteering. So that there's lots of different elements that kind of affect their lives. But at the same time, they're still living in the community, right? So they're still walking or using the bus to get to treatment every day. They're still able to access the Y or attend basketball games or whatever it is. So they still have this kind of, they're living in this strange kind of in between, right? They're part of the community and yet they're not. And it's a kind of a strange place to be. So that was another factor really underlining like why we wanted to look at this group. There's also a requirement or an expectation that they will fill their own time during the day. So treatment commitments are usually early on, morning groups 5 days a week. So they may be doing 3 to 4 hours of treatment a day. Okay, there'll be a requirement that they do some volunteer or service work while they're at the community residence. But really, they still have a lot of time that's unaccounted for, right? So there's this idea that during this time, they will find things to do. You know that thing about idle hands, right? Well, this is a real problem for many of our folks. And the fact that they have had this lifestyle during their active substance use that has seen them really filling a lot of their time either actively pursuing, using, or recovering from substance use. Now they have a lot of time on their hands. It's really challenging for them to figure out what to do with this. So it was another reason we want to start looking at this transition from active substance use to recovery and where leisure plays its part. So in terms of sampling and recruitment, recruitment took place during September and November of 2019, back in the halcyon days of being able to sit in groups and not wear masks and stuff. We recruited participants from community residences, and then later on, we also recruited some folks from a peer-run community center as well. Total participants were 12, so 10 male and 2 female participants. Of those 12, 10 residents were currently living at community residences. 2 of them weren't currently living there. 1 was living at a private residence, and the other was living in non-licensed recovery housing, essentially housing that was sober housing, but it wasn't licensed or regulated by the New York State OASIS system. Okay. Generally, the length of stay for those 12 individuals ranged from 2 weeks to 7 months, but most of the mean for that was about just over 2 months. So most people have been there for a couple of months. And in terms of initial sampling, like I said, the initial uptake, the sign up for focus groups, I had 28 people sign up for the first round of focus groups. The first focus group I ran, 1 person showed up. It was awesome. I had a tray of subs that made that person's day, as they got to take an awful lot of Wegmans subs home with them. Subsequent groups, I had 2 or 3 people show up, and like I said, so we switched our approach somewhat. So there were a couple of rounds of recruitment. And so we got to the 12 participants. And this was one of the bigger challenges. I said earlier that people don't often look at folks in early recovery for research. And in part, it's because of the challenges of really connecting with this group. They're a highly transient population. Many of them are struggling to adjust to new schedules, new routines in their lives. So it's challenging. It's kind of like, when you've got them in front of you, you have to do the work. And this was really what we learned from this phase, and we applied it to subsequent phases of the study. But when we had people, they were more than willing to sit and tell us about their experiences and what they got from the community residences. Some folks were really happy with their experiences. Others were not. All of them had some frustrations, but all of them had things they really enjoyed and liked about what their experience has been at the community residences. So, yes, they were a difficult group to kind of pin down to do the work with, but when they were actually there doing the work with us, it was really enjoyable. And they were a great group. So maybe I'll have a study at some point in the future where I figure out the best way to work with this group to get them to actually attend your study stuff. But for right now, this is what we've got. So data collection, interviews were conducted between October 21st and December 16th. There was a full interview script, which was using an initial focus group outline. In total, there were 5 interviews, okay, and each lasted around 45 minutes. So it wasn't particularly long, but it was sufficient for what we were looking at. Audio was recorded and then later transcribed. Transcription was done using Otter AI, which is an audio software. You may have used it for various meetings. It's really handy. It records the session and transcribes as it goes, which is really nice. It's about 85 to 90% accurate, depending on how many people are in a meeting, which still means it's hours of correcting, but it's not as many hours as transcribing a full interview. So it was a huge time saver, which was nice. Coding was a priori. In other words, because we were using leisure constraints theory as our model, we started out with those basic assumptions. So the intrapersonal, interpersonal, and structural constraints were our major framework. And then from there, we started to develop subcodes. And we went through about 3 phases of coding on this. So the initial kind of read through was just me sat with printed transcripts and a highlighter and a pen, just making notes, what's being talked about. Then from there, I used Deduce software, which is an analytical program. It's an online piece of software, which allowed me then to code in more depth. Those codes were then sent to a second reviewer for feedback and review and edit. And then the third round of editing or coding came back and incorporate edits and basically a code collapse, which allowed us to kind of find some of our core constraint categories. So there was some information that was collected. So I asked everyone to introduce themselves and then describe some of their preferred leisure activities, okay, which they did. A whole range of different things. Some of them played musical instruments, some of them engaged in art, some of them like board games, video games, the full range of leisure activities. That really wasn't useful in terms of this study. It was information I was more kind of interested to see whether they engaged in lots of group activities or more kind of individual focused activities. And that was something I was collecting for a different purpose. So it really wasn't used in this. But if you've got people in front of you, collect as much as you can and figure out how you're going to use it later on.
Jason, I just had a quick question. So when you're talking about coding, did you have to learn how to do that yourself, or did you have another company that helped you do that? Because coding is not very easy. I've taken C++ and other coding type classes, and they're actually pretty difficult.
Yeah, I wish I had someone do it for me.
Oh, you had to learn it? Wow.
Yeah, so we took classes on coding and qualitative methodology as part of our degree, and then we were doing it. It's such a process. Teaching research methods, I'm just like, qualitative studies give you so much really good information. You'll just pay the price and how long you sit with that information. I told my dissertation advisor I never wanted to do qualitative research ever again. So when I told him on Friday, I've already started developing a new qualitative design for a study in the fall, he just laughed very, very hard at me. There are just some things you can't get from numbers. Quantitative research is really nice in that it's quick. Like the analysis is quick once you know what you're doing. Qualitative, even if you know what you're doing, it's still a very time-consuming analysis process. But you'll get a very different outcome and a much deeper understanding of the experience for people. So Yeah, I think I spent about 2 months coding, which wasn't fun.
You have some deep motivation for this then, because when I took C++, that was difficult and it was like the most basic language. So like, I don't know how people use Python and all those other ones. So good job for you.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely not that sophisticated yet. There's gonna be a lot of learning here, but honestly, the transcription was more frustrating than the coding. So yeah, the coding, once I got into it and started figuring it out, wasn't too bad. It was more the transcription and the time-consuming nature of that. So good. Any other questions? All right, then I'm gonna punt out to you then with a question. So based on your knowledge of the group that was in the study, what do you think were the major types of constraints that came up through our conversation? So thinking about those constraint types, so intrapersonal, interpersonal, and structural. So we'll start with the intrapersonal. What do you think some of the key constraints were that people came up with at that intrapersonal, that internal level as it relates to leisure? Go ahead, Monica.
I've seen a lot of like lack of motivation. Yeah, I would say lack of motivation, and also I mean like some mental health stuff too. I guess depression and anxiety can lead to motivation of like getting out there and being social.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. So lack of motivation. Good. Susan, self-doubt, lack of confidence. Marty, self-doubt, social anxiety, lack of experience. Yeah, so when we were looking at intrapersonal, those are definitely some of the things we were kind of looking at, right? What is it? How do we motivate people to do this? And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So good. What about interpersonal constraints? Yeah, go ahead, Monica.
Sorry.
Maybe like fear of judgment. People, I think maybe everyone's going to think they're like, they know that there's someone in recovery, and that's not necessarily the case of just looking at people.
Mm-hmm. Good. Jesse?
I was gonna say some people are writing in the chat too. But I think also with COVID, I think it's brought a lot more constraints with doing leisure and getting people to be motivated to like leave their house and do things or find other means to participate in leisure than they have to try to do other things because some of the in-person stuff isn't available at this point too.
Yeah.
Some other people also wrote self-doubt and social anxiety, lack of confidence.
Yeah, I got those.
Not knowing where to start, low self-esteem, lack of experience and focus and follow through, limited sober supports.
Yeah, social isolation, shame, fear of failure, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. Yeah, all of those things that kind of affect how we interact with other people, right? That kind of sense of defensiveness around meeting new people. Okay, I always used to talk about, being a 5-year-old or 4-year-old walking into a room of other 4-year-olds, right? Have you ever had the joy of witnessing that? Like, people, right? And then you do a room full of teenagers and it's like, And then you do a room full of rec therapists, sans alcohol. And it's a whole nother experience. And then you add alcohol and then that's another different experience, right? And so for the folks that we're working with, and I'm intentionally pointing to alcohol here because they haven't got that. They haven't got their substance of choice to back them up, right? So that interpersonal element is again being reinforced by their intrapersonal doubts about their ability to interact. Good. What about structural?
I mean, the constraints with COVID and what people are able to do right now is a constraint, and what I guess this is a group home, you said.
Kind of.
But just in general, it depends on where somebody is. Like if they're in in patient psych, there are a ton of constraints. If they're in a substance abuse program, there are like a lot of constraints in different areas everywhere.
Good. Monica, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I'm helping a client right now plan to where he's going to a halfway house, and he's surrounded by like Chipotle and Walmart, and he's not really like in natural spaces or places where he can walk. I mean, that's transportation, but places where he can walk and like recreate, it's a lot of just like retail stores, and there's not too many options for him with transportation and where this house is. And they're expecting him to come with all of these like leisure skills, which he has skills, but he also like, you know, needs that social aspect as well. So that's, I think, very difficult for him.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things about any kind of treatment facility, right? It's like, where are they placed? They're not generally placed in nice residential neighborhoods, because as soon as you do that, the NIMBY crew are out, right, with their placards, and then they're in the town meetings or whatever. And so we tend to kind of push these kind of facilities to poorer neighborhoods or to more industrialized or differently zoned locations within cities or municipalities. And that can be really challenging if there isn't a bus route, or even if there is a bus route, how frequent is the service? Right. So these are some of those kind of structural constraints. So going in, these were exactly the things we were thinking. We were going to see this kind of range of constraints, and it would be, okay, fair enough. Like, money's a problem. That makes sense. They're on a fixed income, right? And most of the money they get goes to the running of the facility, things like that. They're going to struggle with transport. Again, right? There's limited access to public transport, limited funding, so on and so forth. So these were the constraints we went in thinking we were going to get reinforced, and this is going to be really straightforward, and we'll be able to plan an intervention that educates people. That was our initial thought way back in, like, you know, September 2019, which feels like a million years ago at this point. However, what we actually found at the intrapersonal level, okay, we found two subcategories. So leisure knowledge was the first, right? And again, this ties in with the things that you all said. They just didn't know what was available. They had a very limited understanding of what was really out there for them to be able to access, okay? Then the next one, oh, I did set this up. Okay, so Earl, one of the participants, and these are all pseudonyms, they're not people's real names, just for the record. Earl stated, just having the knowledge about things that are going on in the wider community. You know, if you know what's going on, you know you'd be more likely to participate. Well, that makes sense, right? If you don't know something's happening, you don't know to participate. And this was kind of a very frequent refrain of people. They just said they just didn't know. They wanted to do things, they just didn't know about it. They, a couple of times during the conversations, they'd said about participating in a couple of different activities, and I was like, but that's available. And it was the first they heard of it. It's like, oh, that's problematic, right? Another comment, Christopher was explaining, his lack of knowledge of community options inhibited his development of effective leisure habits. I mean, people should find where leisure can fit into their recovery and what the importance is of it for them, right? The thing is, if you don't know what's out there, how do you know what you enjoy, right? If your life has been spent using substances, experiencing other social constraints, all of a sudden you're in recovery, you're being told to fill your time, but you don't know what to do. Okay, so go do something recovery oriented, but I'm not going to tell you what, I'll let you figure it out with zero knowledge. It'd be like setting a 5-year-old in the kitchen and telling them to cook dinner. Something's going to happen. Something will happen. Lord knows what you'll get, but something. It'll be a mess, there'll be burnage, there'll be cut fingers. Maybe you'll get something to eat. I wouldn't bet. I'm with you, Susan. I wouldn't bet on it. But you see, this is the problem. There's an assumption that the folks in early recovery know what they want to do because they're adults. Well, gee, how many adults who aren't in recovery really don't know what to do in their spare time? Okay, and so this starts to become a problem. So leisure knowledge was one of the subcategories we found. The other one seemed fairly obvious, you know, when we were doing an initial work. There's this idea about recovery being its own constraint. I don't want to do things that put my recovery at risk, right? And it seems really obvious. However, when people were talking about this concept, it was a little bit more nuanced than that. Ben was interesting. I don't choose my leisure activities based on their recovery potential. As long as there's no alcohol involved in them, I just do an activity for the pure enjoyment of it. That makes sense, right? I'm in recovery, so I'll just avoid alcohol. Have any of you tried to avoid alcohol? It's kind of ubiquitous in leisure. It's really difficult, and it's increasingly difficult. If you sign up to do a race, for example, you get a beer token increasingly. Have a free beer on us for participating in this healthy activity.
It's like every race that I've done, Jason.
I was going to make a judgment, then I chose not to. I think that's a selective bias, though, right? There's no comment. Okay. But this is a problem. If you go to a leisure center, increasingly there are bars in them. Go to a baseball game, go to a basketball game, there's alcohol. And so go to the state fair. A few years ago, as a social experiment, I didn't drink for like 15 months. I didn't worry about the holidays. They were easy to get through. I wasn't really worried about parties. The hardest thing was the state fair. It was a hot day and there were wine slushies and cold beers. And it's just like, oh my goodness, I did not anticipate this being a challenge. And it was really interesting in terms of the experience of that, because one of the things we often kind of say to people is, oh, go to a fair, do this, do that. But the problem is alcohol is just everywhere. So it's not enough to say I'm going to avoid activities that have alcohol in them, because at some level, there's some connection. And so even when Ben was saying this, he goes on to say, or he went on to describe a trip he took to a fair. It wasn't the state fair, but he consciously took this with non-drinking friends. So the presence or lack thereof of alcohol, while it's outwardly saying it doesn't bother him, as long as there's no alcohol, I'm good. Even with that as his conscious thought, his subconscious was still saying, I need additional support. And so, you know, it's still playing a part. It's still constraining his leisure, because if I rely on people who are also in recovery, I have to know that they're available before I can choose to do this activity. All right. So that consideration, and everyone mentioned that at some level, that, you know, their recovery was going to play a part in their leisure choices. Whether it was a very obvious, I won't do this activity or that activity because I used to do those when I was using, and now I don't want to put myself in that position. All right. Or whether it was more subtle, like Ben, who's like, no, I just will avoid anything with alcohol or drugs. Okay. So that was rather interesting. Interpersonal. The only subcode here was managing relationships, and this kind of came as two levels. So the first level was gossip, which was an interesting element of managing relationships. So in this case, Steve mentioned that isolation was a challenge. And in fact, isolation would have probably been a better subcode here, as you will see with the next category also. But the fear of using again, the necessity of including that fear in every equation, every move you make, for me, keeping it on myself tends to make it easier for me to isolate. The worst thing people can do in recovery is isolate. And yet it's one of the easiest coping mechanisms, especially when you're in an environment with people who you don't know that well, who maybe you can't trust. And this is where the gossip aspect comes in. Several times people mentioned explicitly, like avoiding relationships with people in the house, because before you knew it, your business was out there, right? And so they wanted to keep certain aspects of their recovery private. Also, the recovery community is relatively small. It's a very interconnected group, typically. A lot of people know you and know your business. So gossip is a real threat to people, and it starts to undermine relationships, right? I don't know if I can really make friends or build meaningful connections because I don't know who I can trust. And then if I'm living in this residence with these men or women, I don't know how much I want to share. And that therapeutically becomes problematic too if you're running groups, right? How much am I going to share? How much do I trust the confidential nature of the group that I'm working with? So that was one element. And then the other element contributing to this isolation was technology and the increasing use of cell phones, laptops, and things like that in the community residences, which allowed people to select to not participate, to avoid group activities because they could go to their room and watch a video on Netflix. They didn't need to be in the communal living space. They didn't have to participate in activities that were being arranged. They could go to their room and watch a movie, or just spend their own time in their own way without that social connection. So while traditionally the case for community residences was about connecting with other people at a similar stage of recovery as you, building connections that would help you in your recovery, build fellowship, yada, yada, what we're seeing is this kind of shift via technology that's kind of allowing people to isolate, even in these communal settings, which in turn starts to create constraints, because if I don't have the individual confidence, that intrapersonal confidence to go and try new things on my own, traditionally I may have had other people in the house who would kind of convince me, right? Well, if that's not happening, if I'm isolating, then I'm less likely to participate in new things. I'm less likely to build that expanded network. And one of the things that these folks are often encouraged to do is build a sober social network. Okay, but what does that look like? Go ahead, Monica.
Is it, I'm assuming the answer is no, but is it common to have a rec therapist in houses like this as part of staff? That seems like kind of a no-brainer to have someone there to help out with all this stuff.
It does, but they're not. Usually at this level of care, there's not. Thank you, Susan. Wonderfully gestured. We need to do some of this to make that happen. There's not currently. And so this was another reason we were picking this level of care to see, like, could we make that case? And, it's interesting, like there are staff who are very invested in leisure, but that's another part of the story for another day. But yeah, there was one rec therapist working in one building, and they were experiencing some of their own barriers and challenges. So there's a lot more to the story, but yeah, it does seem like a no-brainer for sure. And this research really kind of added to that. All right, structural. Just look at time, good, okay. So two sub-elements here. So leisure resource constraints and program structure constraints. Leisure resource constraints were about choice and variety. Okay, like how much is really available to people that they're aware of? What are their options when it comes to leisure? So this kind of ties back to that leisure knowledge and awareness. But it also went beyond that to much more kind of mundane, if you will, day-to-day kind of things. So Shauna, I had no money. I had no way to know anything about buses. I didn't know anything about where anything was. And staff just expected me to leave the house and go find somewhere to volunteer. The staff didn't help me. I just didn't know. I didn't have the resources. It was a significant constraint, like the money resource, the access to public transport, just the knowledge of those things. These aren't leisure constraints. They are structural constraints, right? I just didn't have any money. I didn't know how to use the buses. I needed someone to help me with those things. And then Corey, I think there are a lot of times we're sitting around here. So in this case, it was at the community center that I was at, kind of like, okay, what to do? And it can get a little monotonous coming here. And so between these two things, the major aspects of those leisure resource constraints were that staff really weren't providing a full range of options. Like there were things offered, but they seemed like they were the same things, like go to the recovery center, go to a meeting. And that's great. It's kind of like being on a diet and being told, eat lettuce, have a tomato, eat lettuce, have a tomato. How long before that lettuce and tomato are on a Whopper? Right? And so this, sorry, food, it's amazing. Anyway, so this is kind of the problem that people were having. They were being given options, but the options themselves were starting to become a bore to them, and they were becoming their own constraint. They were no longer appealing. And so this starts to, it's not that there wasn't money being invested in these things or that, you know, options weren't being presented, but they were the same options, right? You don't, when you want to go out for a meal, do you always go out for pizza? Right? So, and that was how the residents were starting to feel like we don't get offered much, and what we do get offered is kind of monotonous. The other structural constraint that came up frequently were the constraints of the program structure itself. Okay, so the way the programs are structured, residents are expected to, like say, be out of the house most of the time, so they can stay there overnight. They can only be there those certain times of the day because of the rules of the program. So they generally have to leave by 8 in the morning so they can get the treatment and do their day programs. And then they're not allowed back in the program till like 4 o'clock in the evening. Okay, so the bulk of the day, they have to be out of the house and they have to be finding things to do. So Dan was particularly vocal on this. He was very frustrated. Rees noted that there are about 35 hours of the week, right, where they have to find things to do. His treatment was about 3 hours a week. They gave him almost a full-time job's worth of time that wasn't occupied. So he's like, well, what do I do? I'm supposed to turn in a diary account or a plan for my week. I have to write out a weekly plan. I got a treatment on a Monday, say 9 till noon. And then from Monday lunchtime through Friday afternoon, nothing. What am I supposed to do with that? And so this was one element, and he was frustrated because they couldn't get jobs. There were certain rules around what they could and couldn't do. And then he's like, and then I get back to the house having done nothing all day. And that's when I'm expected to do my laundry and do all these other things, attend house meetings. I have all these obligations that get squeezed into my evenings. And I kind of chuckled because it's like, yeah, can you imagine having to do that? And I was like, well, yeah, I work full time. And so I do have to do that. But yeah, I'm at work all day. I'm not sat around bored off my mind, right? I'm busy, I'm engaged in stuff. So when I get home at night, doing something somewhat monotonous is okay. I can switch my brain off, throw some laundry, and that's all good. If I've been bored all day, it's just like, this is just a waste of time. I could have done this at 10 o'clock this morning, and then this evening when there are people around, I can engage in leisure. Okay, so that was a lot of Dan's frustration around that sort of program structure. The other thing about structural constraints in terms of the program was a curfew and how this impacted leisure choices again in the evening. So 7 o'clock was our curfew. We got to be home by 5 or 5:30 if we don't have a meeting. So we got from 5:30 to 7, and by the time you get on the bus and wait for the bus to get you anywhere, it's going on 7 o'clock, and there's no meeting at that time. So because of the rules of the house where you have to be in the house for meals, okay, you have to be back at a certain time, and then you can go out after dinner. But if you want to get anywhere, you have to use public transport. With that tight curfew of 7 o'clock, there's just no time. And so this kind of led into a much larger conversation about stress and how having that curfew creates this element of stress at a point in the day where most of us are relaxing, right? We get home from work, we want to do something relaxing. Well, the ideal time to do leisure is in the evening, but with such a strict curfew, it's very difficult to engage in leisure at that time. And so it creates this sense of stress and panic in that if I miss my curfew, I can be in trouble at the house, right? I can get disciplinary problems. And so again, what should have been this kind of protective thing was actually starting to create constraints. So the curfew itself was starting to create this sense of fear and anxiety. And I'm not by any means saying, let's get rid of the curfew and let people do whatever they want. No, the rules are in place for a reason. However, how we talk about those rules and how we plan that time becomes a much more critical element. If I know that something's causing people in recovery stress, that's something I should be looking at and examining programmatically. The thing is, people aren't asking those kind of questions in general practice, right? So they don't know. This is just a rule. This is the way it's always been. It's my favorite excuse for anything, right? But we've always done it this way. Okay, maybe we should look at that. So ultimately, when we looked at all of these constraints and facilitators and all these aspects, we really found that despite all those expectations that we expected, going into this around money and knowledge, we generally found that the common theme was actually the staff themselves. And we really didn't expect that. And it seems so stupid that we didn't in hindsight. But the fact is, no one's ever really looked at the role staff play in terms of leisure, not in this setting. And even studies in other settings with intellectual and developmental disabilities and other sort of similar care homes, there's very little research in how staff actually influence leisure programming and attitudes towards leisure. And so where this became kind of significant for us was like, there's this general lack of support across any of the constraint types. So intrapersonal, no one's talking to the residents about their worries about leisure. Like they're not really engaging at this level of, well, why is this a concern to you? Why are you worried about being bored? What kind of things would you like to do? No one's having these conversations. Then at that interpersonal level, there isn't really support. There's not much encouragement to engage in those conversations. And then at the structural level, things like curfews and programming and things like that just aren't really being discussed. So that was our sort of general finding from here. And all of these things really inhibit the ability for the folks to engage in any kind of healthy leisure choices, right? Because they just don't know about them, or they're dependent on connections they're making through 12-step meetings or other recovery groups, things like that. But though just expecting people to go out and engage in these things doesn't work, because many of them lack things like self-esteem, motivation, some of them social skills, just basic things that we're assuming people have, but they don't. The nature of their disorder is that these things have been impaired or impacted in several ways, and we need to work on that. So when we were looking at these constraints, these were the kind of things we kind of came to. So I'm going to ask you all this question. So what does this mean? So, okay, I'm sat here, I've got all this information. It's amazing and cool, and I found some stuff. But what does that mean for us as a profession? Like, what sort of things should we be doing? How do we have this conversation? And Monica's already kind of asked the big question. Why aren't, are there RTs at this level of care? And right now, no is the answer. So what should we be doing? How can we as a profession move forward?
So I think we should be doing a lot of in the hospital type of planning for stuff like this, okay, and setting people up for success, and not just, oh, you're getting discharged next week back to this new house and this new place, and they have no idea where anything is or where to even go. So I think it starts with before that. If they're in the hospital, if they're getting psych treatment, if they're at, I don't know, at like St. Joe's or something, like how can someone as an RT provide support before someone's discharged? Because if we just discharge them right back to where they were, what is their success rate going to be?
The standard remission or return to use statistics are similar to that of hypertension and diabetes, somewhere in the region of 60 to 70%.
I also think it could be like simple things. So we have this individual that has a dual diagnosis, and we started doing virtual NA meetings with her twice a week. So she gets accustomed to learning how to do them, how to log in, and how to be able to do them when she's discharged. So she doesn't have any like surprises. It could be something just like that, or even like doing a church service with somebody so they know how to get into the services and they have this in their back pocket to be able to use. Or I work with this one patient individually, and we found some helpful applications on the iPads that are free for mindfulness that she is learning how to use, using them every week to get accustomed to them so that she could use them at discharge. So I think we need to essentially just set people up for success as RTs for discharge and while they're in treatment.
Yeah, good. Susan W., such a great need for leisure ed, creative exploration, opportunities for self-expression. Structure and more information is also needed. Yeah, just again, like, how do we set people up for this success? Right? It shouldn't be assumed that people understand this, right? I mean, most people with substance use disorders start using during adolescence. Okay, that sort of formative time, even through the opioid epidemic where people maybe start using later. Often that use is a result of things that have occurred in their personal life. So there's a lot of latent trauma there, depression and anxiety that impact the way they engage in leisure. So even if they engage later on in substance use and it becomes disordered, doesn't mean that they're going to be able to just jump right back into the life they had. It's not, life doesn't really work that way. We can't jump back to a previous point, right? We can't just hit pause on everything that's happened and go back. So we still have new things that we should be working on people with. So how do we do that? Leisure ed's a great way of doing that. And in fact, when we started doing this study, the intervention we were planning was around leisure ed. And it was looking at identity formation. So yeah, absolutely. What else? How else can we as RTs make a difference here?
I think we should also have these conversations with people to like talk about these barriers ahead of time and how to work through them.
Yeah, for sure. Again, that kind of discharge planning, preparation, conversation, being open about what these barriers look like. Because honestly, a lot of the folks who I worked with at inpatient, their idea of recovery was, I've stopped using. And that was it. It's like, okay, now what? Like, great, you took step one, now what? What's tomorrow going to look like? What about a week from now? And for so many of them, they hadn't thought that far ahead yet because they were worried about today. Today, I'm not doing this, right? So yeah, Kathy, great point. The discharge planning checklist to give them as part of the admissions process, right? Discharge planning should start from the moment we enter treatment, right? The idea that as we go through treatment, we're already building the skills and the knowledge that we need so that when we leave, we can be successful. First of all, it's good for the individual receiving services. Second of all, from us as providers of that service, it guides and shapes the things that we do. Like that's the truth of tailoring and that person-centered approach, so that we can make sure that people have what they need so that when they're ready to leave, they are well equipped and ready to go. Good. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Monica. You're just going to start yelling at me.
Are most community residences like that where people just need to be out of the house for 7 hours a day? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess I wasn't aware of that. I wish I would have known that. There's like no way of me knowing that, right? As someone who works at a residence. I mean,
yeah, no, not necessarily. I mean, there may be some changes, but because of the congregate level of care, that's kind of how they operate. The thing is, they're being phased out and the new levels of care are much more self-contained.
Okay.
So what that means is rather than individuals going out for services, they increasingly staying in and receiving services on site. And the idea behind that is to stop some of that kind of unstructured time to provide more services in the program. It also improves funding quite significantly to allow for increased medical coverage and services at the houses. So there's more of a harm reduction approach as well in the new model, which is more beneficial than the community residence design. So those models are already in place. They're the new 820 regs. And the community residence model that I used in this study is just phasing out. All right, so they are changing.
So, and then I think another thing is, I feel like we talk about this all the time, is like licensing, right? So if if we could be licensed and essentially get paid for our services, maybe that would also help if we could bill for our services.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about this is if you were to use a community RT model, right, as in you're an RT providing services as part of a community. So in this case, these were all from one agency. So if the agency hired one RT to service all of these residences, they would more than like just the additional kind of retention would probably help cover the cost, right? You don't need to have you don't need an RT in every facility. You just need one RT supporting these facilities. One RT in every one would be amazing, but from an economic standpoint, that's not going to happen. Licensure would help, but some of it's just also about being creative and pitching our services in the right way. The other thing is these are relatively small residences, so it's easier to kind of have one person servicing each of them, and then they can do some combined work between the residences, adding to this idea of fellowship and connection as well. Like, this is how we build networks. We'll work with these folks from this residence and these folks from this residence. So you're kind of creating those networks. But again, people have to be creative and be able to advocate for that. And that's often the challenge. But this was why the study was done initially, was to start saying, hey, we need this service. And subsequent levels of this research, residents and staff both were like, we would love to have someone dedicated to doing this work. They were looking for this. They needed that support and they viewed it as valuable. It's just then getting the case of the bean counters, right, to figure it out. Licensure would help in some ways, and in other ways it would hurt. In that, and now I have to pay you more.
So can you bill for services provided outside of the treatment center? Like if a rec therapist takes, a group of people out for a few hours, if it's not in the building, could you still bill for that? In the community residence, I guess. If
you're providing a therapeutic service under the umbrella of an agency, is that what you mean? Or is it, that would still be just part of the treatment.
Okay.
Yep. So Oasis used to have the rule that everything had to be provided on licensed premises, but that rule isn't there anymore. It allows them to do things like peer outreach and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Also wanted to mention to Monica too, even mental health in Syracuse, we have a couple of residents through Hutchings and emergency housing. And before COVID, all of the people there were expected to go to day programming during the day and they were not open, which even thinking about it right now, what if the people that live there, some of them just don't like day programming or don't want to attend. They have to figure out what to do all day now.
And it comes back so hard on that whole idea of person-centered practice. It's such a myth in so many ways. It's like, yes, we're person-centered. Everyone get out.
I feel like it's kind of like a dream to like have 7 hours of free time a day, right? But even as someone who I feel like I have a healthy leisure life, right? I feel like after 2 months, I'd be like, I'm over this. I need something to do. So
yeah, exactly. And that was so much of the feedback, which is like, this is too much. We've gone from 0 to 100.
So on your last slide, I just had a question about that. So, or maybe the slide before that. So Shauna was saying like, you have to leave the house, but then she was saying in the evening, she wanted to squeeze a bunch of recreation in an hour and a half.
So what she was saying was like, all day, they don't do very much, right? They're bored most of the day. And then in the evening, when there are things available to do, there's more meetings, more things to do. There just isn't the time to do them. So it's essentially famine or feast, right? During the day, there's nothing for them. And then in the evening, there's lots. But during the day, they have all the time. And in the evening, they have very little. And
is that activities provided by the residents, or is that just, typical activities of
typical activities in the community, which really is what you want people to be engaging in. To a large extent, you want folks to be reintegrating into the community, doing healthy leisure. And yet, and the curfew isn't always 7 o'clock, like it does get later. But even so, like managing those constraints, working with people to help them is such a critical part. And that's why when we really brought this all back to the overarching themes, it came back down to staff. And like, what are the staff doing and getting that sort of bigger understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So Implications from our perspective of this work are really this greater emphasis on person-centered practice. Again, so much of what we say is, oh, we're person-centered. These models aren't person-centered. They're just not. They're designed to do a job, and it's the same job they've been doing for 40, 50 years, right? The idea that you're on your own, good luck. That's as person-centered as it gets. You're on your own. But there's no support or structure with that. So what would person-centered practice look like in this program if we're supporting the individual in a meaningful way? That would need to involve more training of direct care professionals to understand leisure as a concept in recovery, because later work really kind of highlighted this idea that staff value leisure, but they have a very different understanding of leisure than the residents do because of their different circumstances in life. And just getting this idea that leisure isn't a frivolous pastime, it's a meaningful way for our residents to engage in recovery activities. It's as therapeutic for our residents, if not more so, than going to see the counselor, right? And it's a self-actualizing activity. They benefit from this at multiple levels, but we don't do that training. We don't really emphasize this. So leisure is just frivolous. It's playing board games, right? Sure. The act of playing board games, but that has therapeutic benefit, and that's where that training really comes in. There's also a need for further research. So like I said, this was part 1 of 3 studies that we did as part of my dissertation. The initial intention was to use these as a jumping off point to do a leisure ed intervention and look at identity development. And then COVID hit, like I said earlier, and we changed this based on the findings to say, well, what do staff think? What's the staff attitude here? So the second phase of the study looked at leisure meaning for both staff and residents. We used an instrument, it was quantitative. And then the final phase, we actually did interviews with the staff. So there is more to the story, and it was an interesting find once we put all the data together. But beyond that, looking again at facilitators specifically, not just what things hold people back, but what is it that encourages them? Where does that motivation come from? How can we facilitate more? The initial design was to look at both during this study. It just didn't, the way it was structured just didn't really allow for much work on the facilitators. So that was kind of where that kind of fell short.
Jason, do they do any evaluation? Like, I know, like for inpatient, we do a lot of program evaluation, but do they do any type of like satisfaction evaluation in like those types of? No?
They do, but there's nothing really about leisure. It's all about like, what was the house like? You know, did you do this? Did you do that? And there's nothing really talking about leisure. So it's probably not going to come up. Yeah. And because no one's really talking about leisure, even at the intake, most of the staff, when we spoke to them, were like, yeah, we asked this question, they give us a quick answer, and that's the end of it. There's nothing more meaningful than that. And it kind of sets the scene for a lot of the stuff that goes on. And then, of course, COVID-19, like I said, ruined various iterations of this study. But it also, in some ways, I'm really trying to find positives. But in some ways as well, it kind of gave us that opportunity to think about what this looks like. In a year where we've taken on so much more stuff, like Zoom and technology and using these things, yeah, COVID-19 messed things up, but it allowed us to look for it allowed us to answer some different questions that may have more meaning in the long term than the initial questions we were looking at. So, I don't know. I guess I'm magnanimous at this point. It's okay. Life goes on, right? Questions, we're just about out of time, so we're almost perfect. Questions, thoughts, comments?
Jason, I just wanted to throw a comment out there. This was the first session of yours that I've ever attended, and my biggest regret is that I haven't done this before. Thank you.
I'm usually much snarkier in person.
I love it.
All right, great. Anything else?
So are you going to be publishing this when you're done?
Yeah, this article is already written. The next 2 weeks of my life are all going to be writing. I'm planning to defend at the end of June. So yes, my life is now completely subsumed with dissertation writing. I have no other life. At least don't tell my advisor anything different, please. He's a taskmaster. I just want to thank you all for spending Sunday afternoon with me. I appreciate that. If you have any questions, thoughts, or comments, feel free to shoot me an email, jason.page@cortland.edu, and I'll happily get back to you. Lani, is that a question? Or is your screen frozen with your hand up? I'm guessing the latter. All right.
No, I was just saying thank you.
Oh, okay.
Bye.
You're more than welcome, and goodbye. Have a great afternoon. Good evening, everyone. I hope next year we can be together in person, because I kind of miss the conference world. Quick plug, since I have like a minute or two left. SUNY Cortland conference this year, the REC conference. We are looking for presentations, and it's going to be a hybrid event. So there will be some in person and some online. So keep your eyes peeled for information on that event. It's November 4th and 5th. Thanks, Jess. Just for the plug out.
Thank you. So if everyone could please send their attestation, like I said at the beginning, by June 13th. Thank you, Jason, so much for presenting. This was a lot of great information, and I'm sure a lot of people got a lot of value out of what you had to say today. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks all for coming.
Yeah, good luck.
Yeah, I'll need it. I mean, yes.